On the western edge of the Mediterranean Sea, there are two mountain peaks known as the Pillars of Hercules, one on the northern tip of Africa, the other on the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. They sit on opposing sides of the Strait of Gibraltar, only 8 miles apart. And according to legend, it was Hercules who did one of two things. He either plowed between them to allow waters from the Atlantic Ocean to flow into the basin that sustained every civilization around the Mediterranean, or alternatively, he forced them toward each other to seal off the Mediterranean from the monsters of the deep. And either way, these two peaks, between which came monster-free seawater, were seen as the very edge of the inhabitable world, beyond which no one was meant to venture. But at the turn of the 17th century, the English Attorney General and Lord Chancellor Sir Francis Bacon published a groundbreaking volume of philosophy with a depiction of these pillars of Hercules on the front page, glossed with the following phrase: "Many will pass through, and knowledge will only grow." For many, Francis Bacon was the framer of the modern scientific method and the father of empirical science, putting observation rather than abstraction at the center of the discipline. He insisted that only if we open our eyes to pursue the truth can we find solutions to the challenges at the core of our condition. And it was his insistence that helped launch the scientific revolution that led to all the inventions of modern medicine. But it was not an easy revolution to lead, as it sought to overturn beliefs that had accrued over centuries of tradition. When faced with astronomical observations that suggested that not us but the sun lay at the center of our planetary system, scientists were faced with a refrain that came to be embraced by Chico Marx in Duck Soup. Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? And huge swathes of the clergy, from priests and pastors to monks and bishops and ministers, refuted the findings of the new so-called science and cited in their defense a verse that we read this morning and say as part of our prayers at least twice a day. Lo taturu acharei einechem. Do not follow after your eyes, asher atem zonim achareihem, which will lead you astray. And this is our question. Does heaven seek to suppress the scientific method? Does this verse aspire to stifle our curiosity, curb our discovery, and limit the empirical imagination that has proven to advance our mission and improve human lives? Does our sacred text seek to place a veil over our eyes and confine our minds behind the monotheistic equivalent of the Pillars of Hercules? And if the answer to all of these questions is no, why does God warn us not to follow our eyes? Now, for almost every commentator out there, from Rashi to the Ramban and the Abarbanel, this insistence on averting our eyes has nothing to do with opposing science. For all these readers, the verse does not concern the scientific method of observation or dispute the redemptive potential of the empirical imagination. It simply militates against the most morally debilitating force known to humankind: desire. In Rashi's rather famous formulation, ha'inayim he'meraglim laguf, the eyes are a kind of spy for the body. Mesarserin lo et ha'averot, seeking out sins for it to commit. The eyes are the windows through which our instincts seek fuel to feed their satisfaction. As Rashi concludes his remark, ha'ayin ro'eh, the eye sees, halev chomed, the heart desires, haguf oset havera, and the body commits the sin. Now for him, this is the meaning of the creed that we read and repeat every single day. Lo taturu acharei einechem. Do not allow your eyes to fire up your desires, mire your soul in vice, silence your inner voice, and lead you astray. But there is another way to read this phrase that we say daily that sees it neither as about desire nor as in opposition to science. In fact, it is a view expressed by Maimonides, perhaps the most prominent and influential religious scientist in Jewish history. And for him, this biblical insistence on ignoring our eyes is in fact the very root of the empirical imagination. It is for him the verse upon which science ultimately relies, because it reminds us that our eyes can lie if we do not scrutinize properly. Lo taturu acharei enechem, do not follow after your eyes, for Maimonides means lo yimashech achar da'ato ha'tzara, do not be fooled by shallow observation, v'damer shemach shvato maseget ha'emet, and imagine that we have discovered the truth. Our eyesight, Maimonides says, is not infallible. Our vision is not impeccable. Sometimes pivotal realities are imperceptible. The atmosphere is filled with elements that we cannot see but are critical for us to live and hear and breathe. Science requires us to use our eyes, but at the same time to refuse to rely on them entirely, because sometimes our sight can blind our minds to truths that are indispensable but cannot be seen. As George Eliot put it in a simple sentence, do not judge a book by its cover. Or as Shakespeare put it in The Merchant of Venice, all that glitters is not gold. Gilded tombs do worms enfold, sometimes appearances can be misleading. And this morning we read of 12 princes among men who left the desert to inspect our heaven-pledged future territory to determine, among other things, Meh Ha'arim, what the situation was with the cities. Ha b'machanim im b'mivtsarim, were they accessible or protected? Were they open or closed? And upon seeing tall walls of solid stone, 10 of the men lost hope. In the face of impenetrable barricades and defenses that they could not easily scale, they saw their fortified enemies as near invincible. And our sages suggest that it was precisely this hypothesis that was their failure. It is true that tall walls can be hard to scale, but there are more important matters in war than stone. As our sages put it in one midrash, im b'machanim hem, if the cities were open, him giborim, it would show that they were strong, ubotchim al kocham, and had confidence in their strength. Im b'mivtsarim, but if the cities were closed and walled in and fortified and barricaded, chalashim hem, it shows the people themselves were weak, v'libam rach, and were in possession of psychological insecurity. For these sages, the scouts allowed their eyes to blind them to the reality that lay behind enemy lines. They had bricks, but no conviction. The spies allowed thick fences to numb their senses and freeze their ability to reason. As the 18th century English poet and illustrator William Blake once wrote, this live-steam windows of the soul distorts the heavens from pole to pole and leads you to believe a lie when you see with rather than through the eye. Lo taturu acharei einechem, do not rely entirely on your eyes, asher atem zonim achareihem, for they will lead you astray. They permit us to navigate by day but cannot pierce the night. They allow us to perceive the visible but cannot scan the mind. As our ancestors stood on the cusp of autonomy, they learned that looks can be deceiving, that appearances can be misleading, that conviction can be more important than bricks, that faith can be more fundamental than fences, that hope more than sticks and stones can lead a people to eternity. So let us all refuse to follow our eyes if they even suggest that we cannot realize our dreams. Let us together venture past the pillars of Hercules and make our dreams come to be. Shavua Tov.